What if I told you that between 1948 and 2010, the United States government conducted at least 50 documented psychological operations on its own citizens? Programs so audacious, they sound like conspiracy theories until you read the declassified files? That in 1953, the CIA dosed unwitting Americans with Elston brothels while filming through two-way mirrors? Or that the Army released what they called harmless bacteria over San Francisco in 1966, leading to at least one death? These aren't conspiracy theories. They're footnotes erased from textbooks, buried in congressional records, and FOIA requests that took decades to process. If you're ready to uncover what was buried, hit subscribe. Get comfortable, pour something warm, dim the lights, and settle in. We're walking through the archives of power tonight. The doctor seemed respectable enough. By the early 1950s in Cincinnati, Dr. Eugene Sanger had built a solid reputation at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, the kind of career built on peer-reviewed publications and professional courtesy. What the 88 cancer patients didn't know, as they agreed to participate in what they believed was experimental treatment, was that the Department of Defense was funding something else entirely. According to Atomic Energy Commission memos later obtained through FOIA requests, Sanger's experiments weren't designed to cure anyone. They were designed to measure how much radiation a human body could withstand before cognitive function degraded, data the Pentagon wanted for nuclear warfare scenarios. The patients, most of them poor and black, received total body radiation doses that had nothing to do with treating their cancers. Some died within weeks. The families were never told the truth. Decades later, a federal investigation would confirm what had been suspected all along. The consent forms were deliberately misleading, the medical justification fabricated, and the real client was the military. It's the kind of arrangement that should have been impossible in a democracy. Technically, it happened under the supervision of a respected university hospital. Now we turn to the silver screen. In the autumn of 1957, a market researcher named James Vickery made an announcement that would change American anxiety forever. During a 6-week test at a movie theater in Fort Lee, New Jersey, Vickery claimed he'd flashed the phrases "drink Coca-Cola and eat popcorn" on screen for 1/3000th of a second. Too fast for conscious perception, but supposedly long enough to increase sales by 18% for Coke and nearly 58% for popcorn. The story spread like wildfire. The FCC launched an investigation. State legislatures introduced bills banning subliminal advertising. The public was terrified that their minds could be invaded without their knowledge. Here's what's darkly funny. Vickery later admitted the whole experiment was fabricated, a publicity stunt to drum up business for his failing marketing company. But by then, the CIA and military intelligence had already started their own programs, testing whether subliminal messaging actually worked. The panic was fake. The programs it inspired were real. The FCC investigation found nothing because there was nothing to find in that theater. But in labs funded by the Department of Defense, researchers were already testing whether fear could be implanted through frames of film most people would never consciously see. What followed was quieter and far more deliberate. In 1953, the CIA needed credible academic cover for psychological research that couldn't be traced back to Langley. Dr. Harold Wolff at Cornell Medical College seemed like the perfect partner, a respected neurologist with impeccable credentials and a willingness to ask few questions about funding sources. According to Senate Church Committee files declassified in 1975, Wolff's laboratory became a CIA front, laundering more than $300,000 through Cornell to study stress, interrogation, and what the agency delicately called special methods. The research subjects were often patients at New York Hospital who had no idea their treatment was doubling as intelligence research. Wolff's work helped develop techniques that would later appear in CIA interrogation manuals. When questioned years later, Cornell initially denied any knowledge of the arrangement, then quietly acknowledged the funding, but insisted the research had been purely medical. The university never faced sanctions. Wolff's academic reputation remained intact until his death. The patients he studied were never informed. never compensated, never acknowledged. It's remarkable how much you can accomplish with the right letterhead and a policy of institutional silence. The final piece of this opening act played out in American classrooms. Beginning in 1951, Harvard researchers received funding from the Air Force to study something that seemed benign on the surface: how children responded to civil defense education. The duck and cover campaigns, those cheerful films teaching kids to hide under desks during nuclear attacks, weren't just public safety theater. According to declassified Air Force reports obtained in the 1990s, military psychologists wanted data on fear conditioning in minors, measuring whether repeated exposure to nuclear anxiety would create a more compliant, security-focused adult population. Schools in Boston and other cities became unwitting laboratories. Researchers documented which messaging created the most lasting anxiety, which authority figures children trusted most, which images produced the strongest stress responses. The parents signing permission slips thought their children were participating in routine educational assessments. The Department of Defense was collecting data on how to psychologically prepare an entire generation for permanent crisis. Decades later, psychologists would identify the Cold War cohort's unusually high rates of generalized anxiety disorder. The connection was documented, but never officially acknowledged. The programs were defended as necessary civil defense. The trauma they measured was filed away as successful data collection. And somehow, that made perfect sense to everyone in charge. The machinery started in plain sight. In the spring of 1948, a CIA officer named Frank Wisner stood in a Washington office and outlined what would become one of the most ambitious domestic influence operations in American history. Operation Mockingbird, as it was internally designated, wasn't a surveillance program or a covert action against foreign targets. It was a systematic recruitment of American journalists, editors, and media executives to shape domestic news coverage in ways favorable to CIA objectives. According to Church Committee testimony delivered in 1975, Wisner's operation eventually controlled relationships with more than 400 journalists across major American news organizations, newspapers, magazines, television networks. Some knew they were working with the agency. Most were simply cultivated through social connections, shared anti-communist ideology, and the occasional off-the-record briefing that made them feel like insiders. The beauty of the program, from the CIA's perspective, was its deniability. Nothing was written down as direct instruction. Reporters simply understood which stories to emphasize, which sources to trust, which angles served national security. When the operation was finally exposed in congressional hearings, the CIA admitted to the relationships, but insisted no editorial control had ever been exercised. Several named journalists denied the allegations entirely. Others shrugged and explained that everyone understood the Soviet threat required certain accommodations. Not a single journalist was disciplined by their news organization. Mockingbird was officially terminated. The relationships, by most accounts, simply continued under different management. Next comes a question of vocabulary. By 1967, the CIA faced a growing problem. Independent American publications were starting to question official narratives about Vietnam, civil rights, and government overreach. Cord Meyer Jr., a senior CIA official running covert cultural programs, had a solution that was elegant in its simplicity. According to the March 1967 expos published by Ramparts magazine, followed by confirmatory reporting in the New York Times, the CIA had been secretly funding dozens of domestic cultural organizations, academic conferences, literary magazines, and student groups through a labyrinth of foundations that existed primarily on paper. The money was real. The oversight was non-existent. The publications receiving funding had no idea their operational budgets were being supplemented by Langley. When Ramparts broke the story with documented financial trails, the CIA initially called it a fabrication, then admitted to some cultural funding, then released a statement insisting the programs had been discontinued. Congressional investigators later confirmed the funding had continued through the 1970s, simply routed through more layers of front organizations. Meyer himself defended the program as necessary to counter Soviet cultural influence. The journalists and academics who'd unknowingly taken CIA money were told they were victims of deception. Most kept their positions. The foundations quietly dissolved. The funding found new channels, and the definition of propaganda remained a subject of semantic debate. You couldn't call it propaganda if the recipients didn't know where the money came from. Then there's the story nobody reported. On a clear day in September 1962, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps decided Minneapolis needed a field test. According to Senate hearings held in 1977, 15 years after the fact, military researchers released zinc-cadmium sulfide particles over the city to simulate how a biological weapon might disperse in an urban environment. They told no one, not the mayor, not the public health department, not the 20,000 residents who inhaled the particles over a 6-week period. Local newspapers were fed a cover story about routine military exercises. The particles were described as harmless, a word that does a lot of work when you're releasing industrial compounds into the air above a civilian population. Years later, researchers would link zinc-cadmium sulfide to potential carcinogenic effects. The Army maintained the exposure levels were too low to cause harm. When questioned under oath in 1977, military officials acknowledged the test but explained it had been essential for national defense. No health monitoring was conducted on exposed residents. No compensation was offered. The program was defended as prudent preparation for Soviet bioweapon attacks. One documented death, a civilian who developed acute respiratory distress during the testing period, was dismissed as coincidental. The operation was classified until a Senate investigation forced partial disclosure. The full test parameters remained sealed, and the precedent was established. You could test weapons on American cities as long as you called it simulation, and nobody found out for 15 years. What came next wasn't even hidden. In 1975, during testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, CIA Director William Colby casually acknowledged a program that made Mockingbird look almost quaint. For decades, the CIA had been producing what they internally called news packages, pre-written, professionally produced news segments designed to look like independent journalism. These packages were distributed to local television stations, particularly smaller markets with limited reporting resources, where they would be broadcast as if they were the station's own coverage. According to declassified Senate Intelligence Committee records, the practice continued from the early 1950s through at least the mid-1970s, with hundreds of packages distributed annually. The stations broadcasting them had no way to verify the sourcing. Many didn't even know the CIA was the originating producer. The packages came through intermediary distribution companies that presented themselves as independent news services. The content was carefully crafted to seem ideologically neutral, while subtly shaping coverage of foreign policy issues, domestic security debates, and political movements the agency wanted to influence. When the program was exposed, the CIA explained it had been a necessary tool for countering Soviet disinformation. None of the television stations faced FCC sanctions. None of the broadcasters who'd unknowingly aired CIA content were required to issue corrections. The program was officially discontinued in 1976. Industry observers noted that nothing in the oversight reforms actually prevented similar arrangements from emerging through contractors. The architecture remained intact. Only the letterhead changed. The professor came with sterling credentials. In the early 1960s, Dr. Leo Hollister ran a research program at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Palo Alto, California, studying psychiatric medications with funding that appeared to come from standard medical research grants. According to FOIA documents released in 1977, those grants were actually CIA money laundered through private foundations, part of the Sprawling the Culture program's effort to study LSD and other psychoactive compounds. Hollister's work at Stanford and the VA hospital involved administering LSD to patients, many of them veterans struggling with PTSD and depression, under the guise of experimental treatment. The patients signed consent forms describing psychiatric research. They weren't told the actual sponsor was the Central Intelligence Agency, or that the research goals had nothing to do with treating their conditions, and everything to do with developing interrogation techniques and chemical control methods. Hollister published his findings in respected medical journals. His academic reputation grew. The CIA got its data on dosing, duration, and psychological effects. When McCullough was exposed in Senate hearings, Hollister acknowledged the funding source, but maintained the research had been scientifically rigorous and ethically sound. Stanford issued no sanctions. The VA continued employing him. The patients, many now deceased, were never informed their treatment had doubled as intelligence research. The published studies remained in medical literature, cited and unchallenged. And the separation between academic medicine and covert operations turned out to be mostly a matter of which foundation name appeared on the grant paperwork. The think tank worked from a former hotel. By 1958, RAND Corporation in Santa Monica had established itself as the premier strategic research organization for the U.S. Air Force, producing classified studies on nuclear deterrence, game theory, and Cold War strategy. What's less known, according to declassified Air Force contracts uncovered by researchers in the 1990s, is that RAND also conducted extensive domestic studies on population control and psychological manipulation of American civilians. The research focused on how to manage public opinion during national emergencies, how to identify and neutralize domestic dissent, and how communication systems could be weaponized to create compliance during crises. The studies were presented as purely theoretical academic exercises in game theory and behavioral psychology. But the language was unmistakable. American citizens were modeled as variables to be managed, populations to be controlled through strategic information deployment. RAND researchers tested messaging frameworks on focus groups, measuring which narratives produced the most desired behavioral outcomes. The work was funded entirely by the Department of Defense. None of it was disclosed to the civilian participants in the studies. When portions were declassified decades later, RAND explained the research had been necessary for civil defense planning. The methodology, treating democratic citizens as subjects of behavioral control, was never questioned. The researchers involved went on to distinguish careers in academia and government. And the fundamental assumption that managing the American public was a technical problem requiring psychological expertise became embedded in how institutions thought about communication during any crisis. Madison Avenue made it easy. Throughout the 1950s, according to CIA memos declassified in 1996, the agency maintained quiet relationships with major advertising firms whose executives shared the view that communist influence needed to be countered through all available means, including domestic public opinion shaping. The collaboration was informal but effective. Ad agencies would provide expertise in messaging, focus group testing, and psychological manipulation techniques that the CIA could apply to both foreign and domestic operations. In exchange, agency officials would provide off-the-record briefings that gave the firms advance information on geopolitical developments, helping them advise corporate clients on international strategies. The arrangement was never formalized in contracts. No money changed hands directly. It was simply understood among a certain professional class that national security and corporate interests often aligned, and that expertise in manipulating consumer behavior translated cleanly into expertise in manipulating political behavior. The memos reveal casual references to our friends in the industry and usual channels for testing public response. When these documents surfaced in the late 1990s, the advertising agencies named either denied the relationships or explained they'd been informal consultations between patriotic citizens. The CIA acknowledged limited outreach to private sector expertise, but insisted no domestic propaganda had resulted. The techniques developed, emotional manipulation, fear-based messaging, creation of artificial consensus, remained standard practice in both commercial advertising and political communication. Nobody suggested the collaboration had been improper. And the boundary between selling products and selling policy dissolved so gradually nobody marked the exact moment it disappeared. Finally, there were the electrodes in Michigan. In 1964, Dr. James Olds at the University of Michigan was conducting what his students believed was basic neuroscience research, studying how electrical stimulation of specific brain regions could trigger pleasure or pain responses in laboratory animals. According to later investigations into declassified military research, Olds was simultaneously working on a Defense Department contract, studying whether the same techniques could be used for behavioral control in humans. Student research assistants, unaware of the military applications, helped develop the electrode placement protocols and mapping techniques. The research was published in academic journals as pure science. The military applications remained classified. By the late 1960s, Olds' work had contributed to a body of knowledge about how to manipulate human behavior through direct brain stimulation, research that would later inform interrogation programs and proposals for controlling dissidents through implanted devices. When the military connections were revealed through FOIA requests in the 1980s, the University of Michigan acknowledged the funding but maintained the research had been conducted according to ethical guidelines of the era. Olds had died years earlier. The students who'd worked on the projects learned decades later that their basic neuroscience training had contributed to behavioral control programs. No university investigation was conducted. The published research remained valid. After all, the science itself was sound. Only the application had been classified. And somehow that distinction was supposed to make everyone feel better about the fact that a generation of neuroscience students had unknowingly helped build the infrastructure for technological mind control. The laboratories had moved from universities to more private spaces by the early 1950s. In November 1953, a CIA officer named Dr. Harold Abramson invited a colleague to his apartment in New York City for what was described as a friendly gathering. The colleague was Frank Olson, a biological warfare specialist working for the Army at Fort Detrick. What Olson didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Abramson had laced his after-dinner drink with LSD. The dosing was part of MKUltra Subproject 4, a CIA program testing whether operatives could maintain cover while unknowingly drugged. According to declassified CIA documents released in 1975, Abramson was running a safe house operation in coordination with the Federal Narcotics Bureau, using his private residence to test psychoactive compounds on unwitting subjects. Olson's reaction was severe. He became paranoid, convinced his career was over, certain he was being watched. 9 days after being dosed, he crashed through a 10th-floor hotel window in Manhattan and fell to his death. The official report called it suicide. Abramson's notes, discovered decades later, documented the dosing but expressed no concern about Olson's deteriorating mental state. The CIA classified the incident and paid Olson's family a settlement on condition they never discussed the circumstances. Abramson faced no charges. His medical license remained active. He continued working on classified projects through the 1960s. In 1994, the Olson family exhumed Frank's body. A forensic pathologist found evidence suggesting he'd been struck on the head before going through the window. The CIA declined to reopen the investigation, and the question of whether it was suicide, murder, or something in between remained officially unresolved, a detail nobody seemed particularly motivated to clarify. The next operation required a different kind of facility. By 1955, the CIA officer George Hunter White had a problem that needed creative infrastructure. MKUltra researchers wanted to study LSD's effects in more realistic social settings, but couldn't risk exposure through traditional laboratory environments. White's solution was documented in Senate Church Committee files with the kind of bureaucratic precision that makes the absurdity land harder. He would open a brothel. Operation Midnight Climax, as it was formally designated, established CIA-funded apartments in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood, decorated to look like typical bordellos, staffed by prostitutes on the CIA payroll. The women would dose clients' drinks with LSD without their knowledge, then engage them in conversation and sexual activity, while CIA officers observed through two-way mirrors, documenting behavioral changes, sexual performance, and interrogation vulnerability. According to White's operational reports, preserved in declassified files, the program ran for nearly a decade. Hundreds of men, primarily marginalized individuals unlikely to report strange experiences to authorities, were drugged and observed. White himself would sit behind the mirror, drinking martinis from a pitcher, taking notes on a pad. The prostitutes were told they were serving their country. The clients were told nothing. When MKUltra was exposed in the 1970s, the CIA admitted to Midnight Climax but maintained the research had produced valuable intelligence on behavioral control. None of the men who'd been dosed were ever identified or compensated. The CIA insisted there were no complete records of subjects. White retired with a full pension and commendations for his service. The Telegraph Hill apartments were quietly vacated, and the operational precedent was established. You could run a drug testing brothel in an American city for a decade. As long as you kept good notes and picked victims, nobody would believe. What happened in Kentucky took longer. In 1963, Dr. Harris Isbell ran the Addiction Research Center at the Federal Prison Hospital in Lexington, a facility that treated, or claimed to treat, drug addiction in federal inmates. According to congressional investigations conducted in 1977, Isbell was also conducting MKUltra experiments with funding secretly routed through the National Institute of Mental Health. His research subjects were heroin addicts serving sentences at Lexington, men who were offered a brutal choice, participate in Isbell's drug experiments, and receive synthetic heroin as compensation, or face withdrawal and the full rigors of incarceration. Most chose the experiments. Isbell's most notorious protocol, documented in his own published research, involved administering LSD to subjects for 77 consecutive days, far longer than any previous human trials, to study tolerance, psychological breakdown, and permanent cognitive changes. The men experienced hallucinations, paranoia, dissociation, and psychological effects that persisted long after the experiments ended. Isbell's published papers described the research as advancing addiction science. The NIM funding appeared legitimate in budget documents. Nobody asked why addiction research required months of LSD administration. When MKUltra was exposed, Isbell's work was cited as among the most extreme examples of the program's ethical violations. He defended the research as consensual. The inmates had agreed after all. The fact that their consent was coerced through addiction was presented as irrelevant. Isbell faced no professional sanctions. His research remained cited in pharmacological literature. The inmates he'd used as long-term test subjects were released back into society with untreated psychological damage and no follow-up care. And the technical distinction between voluntary participation and coercion through withdrawal was left for ethicists to debate while the actual victims were forgotten. Then there were the children. Throughout the 1960s, Dr. Loretta Bender, a respected child psychiatrist at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, was conducting experiments that her colleagues described as innovative autism treatment. According to investigative reporting by journalist John Marks, later confirmed through hospital records obtained via litigation, Bender was administering electroshock therapy to children as young as 3 years old, often without genuine parental consent. The consent forms parents signed described the procedures as necessary psychiatric treatment. They didn't mention that Bender was testing whether electroshock could fundamentally alter brain development, or that her research was being monitored with interest by military and CIA researchers studying behavioral modification techniques. Children with autism, schizophrenia, or simply behavioral problems were subjected to repeated electroshock sessions. Some received hundreds of treatments over months or years. Hospital records documented severe side effects, memory loss, personality changes, regression in developmental milestones. Bender published her findings as evidence that early intervention with electroshock could reset abnormal brain development. Other psychiatrists celebrated her innovative approach. Parents who questioned the treatment were told they were interfering with medical progress. When journalists began investigating in the 1970s, several families came forward with accounts of forged consent forms and treatment administered over their explicit objections. Bellevue and New York University, where Bender held appointments, conducted no formal investigation. Bender retired with her reputation largely intact. She was never charged with any crime. The children she'd treated were scattered. many institutionalized, some dead. And the research continued to be cited in psychiatric literature because technically the data on brain development and electroshock effects was scientifically valid, even if the way it had been obtained would have been illegal if anyone had bothered to prosecute. Sometimes the machinery worked in reverse. In 1970, while Americans watched news coverage of genuine anti-war protests, a smaller operation was quietly destroying the movements from within. According to FBI COINTELPRO documents obtained through the 1971 media, Pennsylvania break-in, and subsequent FOIA requests, FBI agents and informants were creating fake grassroots conflicts between activist organizations that had previously worked together. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Anonymous letters on forged letterhead, sent from one organization to another, filled with inflammatory accusations, threats, and ideological denunciations. The letters were designed to seem authentic, using internal terminology, referencing real individuals, mimicking each group's rhetorical style. According to FBI operational reports, the program successfully fractured coalitions between civil rights groups and anti-war organizations, created violent confrontations between rival activist factions, and diverted activist energy from actual organizing into internal conflict resolution. One documented case involved a letter purporting to be from the Black Panther Party threatening violence against Students for a Democratic Society members. Neither organization had written the letter. Both responded as if it were real. The resulting conflict weakened both groups. FBI agents monitoring the situation filed reports celebrating the success of the operation. When COINTELPRO was exposed, the Bureau acknowledged the letter-writing campaigns, but defended them as necessary counterintelligence against groups that posed threats to national security. None of the agents involved faced charges. The activist organizations that had been manipulated learned they'd spent years fighting enemies that existed primarily in FBI file cabinets, and the strategy remained in the tactical handbook. You could destroy a movement without arresting anyone, just by making them destroy each other with carefully forged words. The prison made it easier. By 1968, the California Department of Corrections was running what it called a special treatment unit at the Vacaville Medical Facility, supposedly a progressive approach to rehabilitating violent offenders. According to testimony before a California legislative committee in 1974, the unit was actually a laboratory for Dr. James McConnell's behavioral modification experiments, testing techniques that ranged from sensory deprivation to chemical-induced paralysis combined with audio recordings designed to reprogram thought patterns. Inmates were transferred to Vacaville without being told they were entering an experimental program. The treatment included extended periods in isolation chambers, administration of psychoactive drugs, including LSD and experimental compounds, and what the documentation delicately called aversion therapy, electric shocks paired with unwanted behaviors or thoughts. McConnell, a psychology professor, an advocate for using behavioral conditioning to eliminate criminal tendencies, published papers describing the unit's success in reducing recidivism. The data looked impressive on paper. What the papers didn't mention was that success was measured by compliance during incarceration, not actual rehabilitation after release. Inmates who went through the program reported permanent psychological damage, nightmares, panic attacks, and inability to trust their own perceptions. When the program was investigated in the mid-1970s, California officials acknowledged the experimental nature but maintained it had been voluntary. Inmates could refuse and return to general population. The fact that refusing meant losing privileges, facing retaliation from guards, and being marked as uncooperative was presented as irrelevant to the question of consent. McConnell defended his work as scientifically rigorous and ethically sound for its time. The Vacaville program was quietly discontinued. No one was held accountable. The inmates who'd been used as subjects were released with no follow-up care and no compensation. And the logic held: you could experiment on prisoners as long as you called it treatment and gave them the theoretical option to refuse. What the CIA learned in Korea came home. In 1963, while official attention focused on the Vietnam conflict, agency psychologists were codifying interrogation techniques that had been tested over the previous decade on American subjects before being deployed overseas. The result was the Kubark Manual, a document whose very name was designed to be unmemorable and whose techniques were designed to break human beings without leaving marks. According to declassified portions released in 1997, the manual drew heavily on research conducted at American universities and with American test subjects, sensory deprivation studies from NE-funded laboratories, stress position research from military psychology programs, and psychological breakdown protocols developed through McCultra's domestic testing. The techniques, extended isolation, manipulation of time perception, self-inflicted pain through stress positions, induced psychological regression, had all been refined on Americans before being packaged for foreign interrogation. The manual was careful to avoid explicitly illegal torture, instead describing psychological manipulation that would accomplish the same goals, destroying a subject's sense of identity, creating complete dependence on the interrogator, producing a state of learned helplessness where resistance became psychologically impossible. CIA officers trained on these techniques at facilities in the United States, practicing on each other and on volunteers, whose exact identity and consent procedures remain classified. When portions of Kubark leaked in the 1990s, former CIA officials defended it as necessary for Cold War intelligence gathering. Human rights organizations pointed out the techniques described met the legal definition of torture. The agency noted that the manual had been superseded by newer guidelines. Nobody addressed the fundamental question: if the techniques were acceptable to use on foreign subjects, and they'd been developed by testing on Americans, what did that say about the value system underlying the entire program? The manual remained classified in full. The Americans who'd served as test subjects were never publicly identified, and the knowledge base built on their suffering became standard tradecraft, taught to new generations of officers who had no idea their training materials had been written in American blood. The soldiers saw the films at Fort Detrick. In 1958, according to declassified Army research reports obtained through the National Security Archive, military psychologists were testing whether patriotic imagery could be enhanced with embedded fear triggers. Frames of threatening images flashed too quickly for conscious recognition but supposedly processed by the subconscious mind. The research involved showing soldiers training films that appeared to be standard military education materials, proper uniform protocol, weapons maintenance, chain of command procedures. Buried in these films, at intervals measured in milliseconds, were images designed to trigger anxiety, threatening faces, scenes of violence, representations of chaos and disorder. The soldiers watching reported feeling vaguely unsettled, but couldn't identify why. Researchers measuring their stress responses documented elevated cortisol, increased startle reflexes, and greater compliance with authoritarian commands after viewing the embedded content compared to control groups. The research reports concluded that subliminal fear conditioning could make soldiers more responsive to orders, more accepting of strict hierarchy, and more willing to view outsiders as threats. The findings were classified and filed away. The soldiers who'd been test subjects were never told about the embedded content. Similar techniques appeared in later military training materials, though documentation of their use remained classified. When portions of the research surfaced in FOIA releases decades later, the Army explained it had been exploratory research that was never operationalized. Psychologists reviewing the documents noted the described techniques appeared in various military training programs throughout the following decades. The discrepancy was never officially resolved, and the question of whether you could make someone more obedient by showing them fear they couldn't consciously perceive was answered definitively: yes, you could. The only remaining question was whether anyone would care. The letters arrived with perfect timing. Throughout 1971, as activist organizations struggled with internal divisions that seemed to arise from nowhere, FBI informants were orchestrating conflicts that felt organic but were entirely manufactured. According to QuentelPro documents obtained after the media break-in, FBI agents had perfected the art of the poison pen letter, correspondence designed to create maximum distrust between organizations, destroy personal relationships, and fracture coalitions through accusations of betrayal, collaboration with authorities, or ideological impurity. The Bureau's files reveal a systematic program. Agents would identify tensions within or between activist groups, then send forged letters designed to inflame those tensions into open conflict. One documented case involved fabricating a letter that appeared to be from a prominent civil rights leader accusing anti-war organizers of racism and opportunism. The anti-war organization responded with their own accusations. The civil rights group, seeing the response but unaware the initial letter was fake, assumed the anti-war movement had genuine hostility toward them. The coalition collapsed. FBI files note this as a successful operation. Similar forgeries destroyed personal friendships, ended romantic relationships, and created violent confrontations between groups that had never actually threatened each other. When the program was exposed, former activists realized they'd spent years responding to provocations that had never really existed. The FBI acknowledged the forgeries, but characterized them as legitimate counterintelligence tactics against groups that threatened national security. None of the agents who'd written the letters faced prosecution. After all, sending fake letters wasn't illegal, was it? The activist movements that had been fractured never fully recovered. The sense of paranoia the letters created, the understanding that any communication might be fabricated, any conflict might be manufactured, lingered long after QuentelPro officially ended. And the technique proved so effective it remained in the tactical playbook, ready to be deployed under different program names whenever social movements needed disrupting. What fell on American cities wasn't always visible. Between 1945 and 1963, according to declassified Atomic Energy Commission documents obtained through decades of FOIA litigation, the EC conducted secret tests releasing radioactive materials over populated areas to study dispersal patterns, environmental contamination, and human exposure levels. The tests involved releasing iodine-131, ruthenium-106, and other radioactive isotopes from facilities in Washington State, Tennessee, and other locations, deliberately allowing the materials to drift over downwind communities. Residents of nearby towns, many in rural areas with limited political power, breathed the contaminated air, drank milk from cows grazing on contaminated grass, and absorbed radiation doses that wouldn't be measured or acknowledged for decades. According to later epidemiological studies, communities downwind of the Hanford facility in Washington state showed significantly elevated rates of thyroid cancer, particularly among children who'd been exposed during the 1940s and 1950s. When researchers began documenting the cancer clusters in the 1980s, the ex-successor agencies initially denied any connection to the releases. Then they acknowledged the releases but claimed they'd been within safety limits. Then they admitted the safety limits had been wrong. At each stage, the institutional response was to minimize, delay, and deny until the evidence became overwhelming. A few victims eventually received modest compensation through special legislation. Most died before seeing any acknowledgement. The ex-scientists who designed the tests faced no sanctions. They'd been following protocols, conducting necessary research, and the fundamental calculation held: you could knowingly expose thousands of Americans to radiation, document the resulting cancers, and face no consequences as long as you classified the research and waited until most of the victims were dead before admitting what you'd done. The hospital rooms looked like any others. In 1961, Dr. Eugene Sanger was back at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, this time with expanded funding from the Department of Defense and a larger subject pool. According to documents obtained by investigative journalists in the 1990s and confirmed by a presidential advisory committee, Sanger was now administering total body radiation to terminal cancer patients, doses far higher than anything justified by treatment protocols, designed instead to generate military data on radiation exposure and cognitive function. The patients were told the radiation was experimental cancer therapy. They weren't told the dosing levels were calibrated to military specifications, not medical need. They weren't informed that the Pentagon was funding the research specifically to understand how soldiers would function after nuclear exposure. They didn't know their responses were being documented for weapons-related research. According to hospital records, at least 24 patients died within weeks of treatment, their deaths hastened by radiation doses that served no therapeutic purpose. Families signed consent forms that mentioned radiation treatment but buried the experimental nature in medical jargon. Some patients were never told they were part of a research program at all. When the experiments were finally exposed in 1994, the University of Cincinnati conducted an internal investigation that concluded Sanger had violated contemporary ethical standards. But no criminal charges followed. The university paid a settlement to victims' families in exchange for confidentiality agreements. Sanger maintained until his death that the research had been conducted according to the ethical understanding of the time. And the pattern repeated: respected institution, decorated researcher, vulnerable patients, military funding, families kept in the dark, and decades of delay before truth emerged, by which time everyone responsible was retired or dead, and accountability had become a question for historians rather. Then prosecutors. The exposure began not with official channels, but with a burglary. On the night of March 8, 1971, while America was distracted by the Muhammad Ali-Joe Frazier fight, 8 ordinary citizens calling themselves the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into the Bureau's small field office in Media, Pennsylvania. According to their later accounts and the documents they released, they spent hours methodically photographing files, looking for evidence of the political surveillance they suspected but couldn't prove. What they found was COINTELPRO. Thousands of pages detailing the FBI's systematic campaign to infiltrate, disrupt, and destroy domestic political organizations through illegal surveillance, forged documents, and manufactured conflicts. The burglars copied everything they could carry and mailed the documents to major newspapers. The Washington Post published them. The FBI launched a massive investigation to identify the burglars, but failed. Director J. Edgar Hoover, furious at the exposure, initially denied the programs existed, then claimed they were necessary counterintelligence, then quietly ordered COINTELPRO officially terminated in April 1971. The documents revealed what activists had long suspected: the conflicts tearing apart their movements weren't organic, but manufactured. The paranoia wasn't unfounded, but deliberately cultivated. And the FBI had spent years treating American citizens exercising constitutional rights as enemy targets. None of the agents who'd run COINTELPRO operations faced prosecution. The burglars were never caught. They maintained their anonymity for over 40 years, only coming forward in 2014 when the statute of limitations had long expired. And the precedent was set by citizens, not officials. Sometimes the only way to expose government wrongdoing was to break the law yourself, and hope history would judge you kindly. What followed was unprecedented. In January 1975, Senator Frank Church of Idaho convened the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. A mouthful of a title for hearings that would crack open the intelligence community's domestic operations. According to the committee's published reports, which eventually totaled over 20,000 pages, investigators uncovered programs so extreme that even senators accustomed to Cold War secrecy were visibly disturbed. The hearings were televised. Americans watched as CIA and FBI officials testified about MKUltra, COINTELPRO, Operation Chaos, and dozens of other domestic programs that had operated without congressional oversight or legal authorization. Church himself described the intelligence apparatus as a secret government operating outside constitutional constraints. The committee exposed the CIA's domestic mail opening program, which had read millions of Americans' letters over 2 decades. They revealed Operation Shamrock, in which telegraph companies had provided the NSA with copies of every international telegram sent by Americans. They documented assassination plots, poison laboratories, and mind control experiments that sounded like fiction but were backed by internal agency memoranda and testimony from participants. The testimony was damning. The documents were conclusive. The public reaction was muted. Some were outraged. Many seemed unsurprised. After Vietnam and Watergate, had anyone really expected better? The committee issued recommendations for oversight reforms. Congress passed the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The agencies promised to respect new boundaries. And then everyone went back to business. Because the machinery was too large, too complex, and too valuable to actually dismantle. The programs were officially terminated. The authority structures remained intact. The personnel stayed in place. Only the paperwork changed. The documents surfaced in batches. In 1977, researcher John Marks filed FOIA requests for CIA records on behavioral modification programs, expecting heavily redacted refusals. Instead, due to what appeared to be a filing error, he received 16,000 pages of McCultra documents that were supposed to have been destroyed. According to Marx's later account in his book The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, the documents revealed the program's full scope: 149 subprojects conducted through universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies, testing everything from LSD and electroshock to sensory deprivation and hypnosis, using thousands of unwitting American citizens as subjects. The documents included budgets, progress reports, and casual correspondence between CIA officers discussing drug tests as if they were ordering office supplies. Agency Director Richard Helms had ordered all McCultra records destroyed in 1973, but these documents had been misfiled in a budget archive and survived the purge. When Marx published his findings, the CIA acknowledged the documents were authentic, but maintained the program had been terminated years earlier. Victims began coming forward with accounts that matched the documented experiments. Some were believed. Many were dismissed as mentally unstable. After all, they were claiming the government had secretly drugged them, which sounded like paranoid delusion, except it was exactly what the documents proved had happened. Congressional hearings were held. Apologies were issued. And the fundamental question went unanswered. If these records only survived by accident, what was in the files that were successfully destroyed? The CIA claimed the destroyed documents would have revealed nothing new. Nobody believed them. Nobody could prove otherwise. And the history of McCultra remained incomplete by design, with the darkest chapters successfully erased. Then came the human cost in detail. In 1993, journalist Eileen Wellsome of the Albuquerque Tribune began investigating rumors of radiation experiments conducted in the 1940s. Through meticulous research in declassified documents and hospital records, she identified 18 Americans who'd been injected with plutonium without their knowledge or consent, their bodies treated as test instruments to measure how the element dispersed through human tissue. According to her reporting, which would win the Pulitzer Prize, the victims included hospital patients who'd been told they were receiving new treatments, prisoners offered medical care in exchange for participation in unspecified research, and terminally ill patients whose families were never informed about the plutonium injections. The experiments were conducted at major hospitals in collaboration with the Manhattan Project and later the EC. Doctors tracked the plutonium's movement through subjects' bodies via their excrement and tissue samples. Some subjects lived for years, their bodies slowly contaminated, their cells gradually degraded by alpha radiation. None were told what had been done to them. When Wellsome's articles appeared, they forced a national reckoning. President Clinton ordered a comprehensive investigation. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments was formed. In 1995, Clinton issued a formal apology and announced a compensation fund of $4.8 million for victims and their families. It sounded like accountability. But the investigation revealed the plutonium injections were just one program among hundreds. Radiation experiments had been conducted on pregnant women, children, prisoners, mentally disabled patients, and cancer patients across the country for decades. The compensation fund covered only a fraction of victims. Most died before seeing any acknowledgement. The doctors who'd conducted the experiments were never charged. They'd been following government protocols after all. And the apology while historic, came 50 years late for people who'd spent their lives as unknowing subjects in nuclear research, their suffering classified as national security data. The confession was carefully managed. In February 1977, CIA Director Stansfield Turner appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee to address McCullough. According to hearing transcripts, Turner's testimony followed a pattern that would become familiar: acknowledge the program's existence, express regret, claim most records were destroyed, insist the full scope would never be known. Turner admitted the CIA had conducted drug experiments on unwitting Americans. He confirmed the use of universities, hospitals, and prisons as research sites. He acknowledged that proper oversight had been lacking and ethical standards violated. Then he delivered the key message. The bulk of McCullough records had been destroyed on Richard Helms' orders in 1973, making comprehensive investigation impossible. The destroyed documents, Turner suggested, likely contain the most damaging details. Details that would now remain forever unknown. It was a perfectly calibrated limited hangout. Admit to enough wrongdoing that denial seems impossible. Express appropriate remorse, then hide behind destroyed evidence to avoid revealing the full truth. Senators pressed for details. Turner repeated that records were incomplete. They asked about specific victims. He said identification was difficult without complete files. They demanded accountability. He noted that the program had been terminated and safeguards implemented. The testimony provided the appearance of transparency while ensuring that the darkest operations remained classified or lost. No CIA officials faced criminal charges. Turner presented the destroyed records as an unfortunate obstacle to investigation rather than deliberate obstruction of justice. And the strategy worked. The public learned enough to feel informed, but not enough to demand prosecutions. The machinery of plausible deniability hummed along perfectly. The victims who came forward faced credibility battles. In 1979, Wayne Ritchie and 77 other Americans filed suit against the CIA, claiming they'd been unwittingly dosed with LSD as part of McCullough. According to court records, most had fragmented memories of bizarre experiences, sudden hallucinations, unexplained paranoia, lost time, that they'd dismissed for years as mental illness or imagination until the McCullough revelations made their experiences make terrible sense. Ritchie, a former Maryland state trooper, had experienced a sudden psychotic break in 1957 during which he'd fired his weapon erratically, behavior completely out of character. For years, he'd believed he'd simply had a breakdown. After reading about McCullough, he realized the timing matched CIA testing in the Washington, D.C. area. His lawsuit, combined with others, presented a problem for the government. If they admitted these specific dosings, they'd open the door to thousands more claims. If they denied everything, they'd contradict their own admissions about the program's scope. The solution was elegant: settle without admitting liability. In 1988, the CIA agreed to pay $750,000 to be divided among the plaintiffs, roughly $9,600 each. The settlement included no admission that any plaintiff had actually been dosed. The CIA maintained they were settling to avoid litigation costs, not because the claims were valid. Victims were offered a choice: accept the payment and sign away all future claims, or pursue litigation with no guarantee of success. Most took the money. They'd been proven right about the program's existence, but couldn't prove their individual participation without the destroyed records. And that was the genius of Helms' document destruction. Without records, victims became unfalsifiable, but also unprovable. Their experience is real, but legally uncertain. The settlement closed the case. Justice remained elusive, and the precedent held: you could destroy evidence of crimes, then use the absence of evidence to avoid admitting specific guilt. The military's response came later and with remarkable tone deafness. In 1994, facing mounting evidence from declassified documents and investigative reporting, Pentagon officials held a press conference acknowledging that the Department of Defense had conducted radiation experiments on American citizens and soldiers for decades. According to the official statement, experiments had included feeding radioactive materials to mentally disabled children at a state school in Massachusetts, exposing soldiers to nuclear blasts at close range in Nevada, and conducting total body radiation on cancer patients without informed consent. The officials expressed regret, then they deployed the different times defense. The experiments had been conducted during an era when ethical standards were different, when the Soviet threat made such research seem necessary, when informed consent wasn't understood the way it is now. According to their statement, no laws had been broken because many current research ethics regulations hadn't existed yet. The logic was circular and perfect. We didn't break rules because we hadn't written the rules yet. And we wrote the rules based on learning what not to do by doing it. Victims' advocates pointed out that the Nuremberg Code, establishing basic principles of research ethics, had been adopted in 1947, before most of the American experiments began. The Pentagon acknowledged the code, but noted it had been written for international war crimes, not domestic research. Compensation was offered, but minimal, a few $1,000,000 divided among thousands of victims and families. No military personnel faced criminal prosecution. The officials who designed and conducted the experiments were defended as patriots who'd made difficult choices in difficult times. And the fundamental question, whether national security could ever justify using citizens as unknowing test subjects, was answered with bureaucratic clarity. It couldn't justify it now, but it had seemed justified then, and that temporal distance was presented as sufficient ethical absolution. Academic institutions chose silence over scrutiny. Throughout the 1990s, as radiation experiments and McUltra operations were revealed through declassified documents, journalists approached universities that had hosted the research: Stanford, Harvard, Cornell, University of Michigan, MIT, dozens of others. According to reporting compiled by various investigative journalists, the institutional responses followed a pattern. First, deny any knowledge. Then, when confronted with documented evidence, acknowledge that research had been conducted but claim no knowledge of ethical violations. Then, when the violations became undeniable, express regret while noting the research had been conducted by individuals, not the institution. Finally, refuse to conduct comprehensive investigations, citing the passage of time and the deaths of key participants. Some universities issued brief statements of regret. None conducted thorough reviews of their role in hosting classified human experimentation. None sanctioned faculty members who'd participated. Most had retired or died by the time revelations emerged. None reached out to locate and compensate victims who'd been experimented on in university hospitals and laboratories. The reasoning, when stated explicitly, was remarkably consistent. Investigating thoroughly would expose the institution to liability, damage its reputation, and serve no practical purpose since the experiments had ended decades earlier. A few universities offered modest settlements to victims who came forward with documented proof. Stanford paid the family of Edward Nevin, the man who died during the Army's bacterial test. Most offered nothing. Professors who'd conducted the experiments were remembered in official histories, if at all, for their other contributions to science. The human cost was footnoted or omitted, and the institutional cover-up succeeded not through active deception, but through passive silence, bureaucratic obstruction, and the simple calculation that protecting reputation mattered more than acknowledging complicity. The universities remained prestigious. The research remained part of their scientific legacy. The victims remained unnamed in official histories, and no mechanism existed to force institutions to confront what had been done in their laboratories, under their letterhead, with their willing participation in the machinery of secret experimentation. The mainstream press finally paid attention, but the timing was strategic. On December 22, 1974, the New York Times published Seymour Hersh's bombshell article under the headline "Huge CIA Operation Reported in U.S. Against Anti-War Forces, Other Dissidents in Nixon Years." According to Hersh's reporting, based on sources within the intelligence community, the CIA had conducted massive domestic surveillance operations in direct violation of its charter, which explicitly prohibited domestic intelligence activities, The article detailed Operation Chaos, a program that had spied on thousands of American citizens, infiltrated anti-war groups, and maintained files on domestic political activists. The story broke just as the Watergate scandal was reaching its conclusion, when public trust in government was already shattered. You might think this would have sparked outrage. According to polling data from early 1975, most Americans were unsurprised. The reaction was exhausted cynicism rather than shock. Of course, the CIA had been spying domestically. Of course, they'd violated their charter. Of course, officials would deny it until evidence became overwhelming. The Times article prompted congressional investigations that would become the Church Committee hearings. But the public response was muted. The demands for accountability qualified. Americans had learned in quick succession about Vietnam deceptions, Watergate crimes, FBI abuses, and now CIA domestic operations. The capacity for outrage had been exceeded. The machinery kept running, not because people approved, but because they were too tired to demand it stop. Hirsch would win a Pulitzer. The CIA would issue careful non-denial denials. Congress would hold hearings. And the fundamental dynamic held: you could violate your founding charter, spy on citizens, and face no criminal consequences as long as the revelation came at a moment when people had already lost faith and couldn't muster the energy to care about one more betrayal. The journalists learned they'd been targets too. In 1976, as the Church Committee continued its work, investigators revealed the full scope of Operation Chaos, a domestic surveillance program that had run from 1967 through 1974. According to declassified CIA documents presented to the committee, the program had monitored over 7,000 American citizens, with particularly intensive surveillance of journalists who covered intelligence agencies, foreign policy, and domestic dissent. The CIA had opened mail, tapped phones, and maintained detailed files on reporters' sources, travel, and personal lives, all without warrants or legal authorization. The target list included some of the most prominent journalists in America. The surveillance wasn't about national security in any traditional sense. According to internal CIA memos, the goal was to identify journalist sources within the intelligence community, track stories before publication, and develop strategies to discredit reporting that might damage agency operations. Some journalists had their tax returns audited after writing critical stories. The CIA would pass information to the ears, suggesting irregularities worth investigating. Others found their sources suddenly unwilling to talk, their phones producing strange clicking sounds, their mail arriving opened and resealed. When Operation Chaos was exposed, journalism organizations expressed outrage. The CIA acknowledged the surveillance but characterized it as limited and focused on legitimate counterintelligence concerns. After all, some reporters might have been unwitting Soviet assets. The fact that no evidence of foreign connections ever emerged was presented as proof the surveillance had been effective. No CIA officers faced prosecution for the illegal wiretaps. The journalists who'd been monitored received no apologies or compensation. And the chilling effect was precisely what you'd expect. Sources became more cautious, reporters more careful, and the informal understanding emerged that getting too close to classified information might make you a target of the very agencies you were covering. The surveillance officially ended. The wariness it created became permanent. The apology tour had already begun by the time most Americans heard about it. In October 1995, President Bill Clinton stood before an audience that included victims and families of radiation experiment subjects and delivered a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. According to the official White House transcript, Clinton acknowledged that thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation, and that the government did not do right by you. He announced the creation of a $4.8 million compensation fund and promised that such experiments would never happen again. It was a historic moment, the first time a sitting president had apologized for human experimentation on American citizens. It sounded like accountability. But the apology came with careful limitations. According to the advisory committee's final report, released alongside Clinton's statement, compensation would be available only to victims of specific documented experiments, and only if they could prove direct causation between the experiment and their harm. The burden of proof fell on victims, many of whom lacked the destroyed records that would verify their participation. The $4.8 million fund, divided among thousands of eligible claimants, worked out to a few $1,000s per victim, less than many had spent on medical care for radiation-induced illnesses. And buried in the committee's report was an uncomfortable truth. Similar experiments had continued in different forms. Radiation research on human subjects hadn't ended in the 1960s, it had simply moved to better documented informed consent procedures, which critics noted was a low bar when the baseline had been no consent at all. Clinton's apology was sincere. The compensation was inadequate, and the fundamental question remained unresolved. If the government had conducted these experiments once, classified them for decades, destroyed records, and only apologized when evidence became overwhelming, why should anyone believe similar programs weren't running right now under different names and facilities whose existence remained classified? Congressional hearings had become theater by this point. On the Senate floor in August 1977, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii delivered a speech that should have been historic. According to the congressional record, Inouye described what investigators had uncovered. There exists a shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism, and the ability to pursue its own ideas of national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself. He was describing the intelligence apparatus that had conducted MKUltra, COINTELPRO, Operation Chaos, and dozens of other programs without congressional knowledge or oversight. Inouye's speech laid out recommendations, stronger oversight, criminal penalties for violations, mandatory reporting requirements, independent inspector generals. The Senate listened. The recommendations were filed in committee reports. A few modest reforms were implemented. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act created a special court to approve certain surveillance activities, and the intelligence committees gained slightly more access to classified programs. But the fundamental structure remained intact. According to former intelligence officials interviewed years later, the programs didn't end. They were renamed, reorganized, and routed through different bureaucratic channels. The oversight reforms created paperwork requirements, but didn't fundamentally limit operational authority. The Special FISA Court approved virtually every surveillance request it received, and the shadowy government Inouye had described continued operating with only cosmetic changes to its accountability structures. Inouye himself would later acknowledge that the reforms had been less effective than hoped. The hearings had exposed the machinery. The machinery had absorbed the exposure and continued functioning, and the lesson was clear. Congressional investigation could document abuses and recommend changes, but without criminal prosecutions or structural dismantling, the most they could accomplish was creating a more careful paper trail for the same activities conducted under new names. The rebranding happened quietly in the early 1980s. According to budget documents obtained through FOIA requests filed in the 1990s, the CIA didn't actually end its behavioral research programs after MKUltra's exposure. It restructured them. Programs were reorganized under different administrative divisions, given new cryptonyms that didn't appear in congressional testimony, and funded through budget lines that described the research in anodyne, bureaucratic language. Behavioral modification became personnel assessment research. Drug testing became pharmacological studies for enhanced performance. The fundamental work continued with more careful documentation and legal review. According to former agency officials who spoke to journalists on background, some of the same researchers who'd conducted MKUltra experiments were rehired as contractors, their institutional knowledge too valuable to lose, despite the ethical controversies. The research shifted from unwitting subjects to volunteers, military personnel, intelligence officers in training, and participants who signed consent forms that buried the actual research goals in technical jargon. It was legal, it was documented, and it was remarkably similar in substance to what had come before. The difference was paperwork. The budget allocations showed steady funding for psychological research throughout the 1980s and beyond, routed through different offices, but totaling amounts comparable to the McCullough era spending when adjusted for inflation. Congress received annual reports on behavioral research, filed and apparently unread. The agency had learned a valuable lesson. You didn't need to end controversial programs. You just needed to rename them, document them properly, and wait for public attention to move elsewhere. The machinery adapted and survived. The Canadians got compensation while Americans got nothing. In 1988, after years of litigation, Canadian victims of McCullough experiments finally won a settlement. According to news reports from the time, the CIA agreed to pay $750,000 to 9 Canadian citizens who'd been subjected to extreme experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal during the 1950s and 1960s. The experiments, conducted by Dr. Ewan Cameron with CIA funding, had been particularly brutal. Extended periods of drug-induced sleep, massive electroshock treatments, sensory deprivation, and attempts to completely deprogram and rebuild patients' personalities. The victims had entered the hospital seeking treatment for depression and anxiety. They'd emerged with shattered memories, destroyed careers, and permanent psychological damage. The settlement was significant because the CIA actually admitted funding the experiments, a rare moment of acknowledgement, but American victims watched the settlement with bitter understanding. According to legal experts at the time, the Canadians had won because they were foreign nationals. The CIA's restrictions on domestic operations made foreign experiments potentially more legally vulnerable than domestic ones. Americans who'd been subjected to similar or worse experiments at U.S. facilities had no equivalent legal avenue. The CIA's legal immunity for domestic intelligence activities, combined with the destruction of records and the state secrets privilege that allowed the agency to block lawsuits by claiming national security concerns, meant American victims faced insurmountable legal barriers. Some tried to sue anyway. The cases were dismissed or settled for minimal amounts with no admission of liability. The Canadians received formal acknowledgement and compensation. Americans received sympathy and suggestions to contact their congressperson. And the lesson was darkly clear. Being a foreign victim of American intelligence programs gave you more legal recourse than being an American victim. The document destruction had been systematic. In 1973, as Watergate intensified and congressional scrutiny of intelligence agencies seemed inevitable, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision that would shape every subsequent investigation. According to testimony before the Church Committee and later admissions by agency officials, Helms ordered the destruction of all McCullough records, tapes, and operational files. The order went out in January 1973, just before Helms left the CIA to become ambassador to Iran, a posting that conveniently removed him from Washington during the gathering storm. According to former officers who witnessed the destruction, employees spent days feeding documents into incinerators and shredding machines. The goal was to eliminate any paper trail that could document the program's full scope, identify all participants, or prove specific experiments. The destroyed materials reportedly included detailed subject files, financial records showing every payment to researchers and institutions, operational memos describing experiment designs and results, and correspondence revealing how decisions were made and who authorized what. By the time investigators began asking questions in 1975, the documentary evidence was ashes. When the 16,000 pages that survived the purge were discovered in 1977, they existed only because they'd been misfiled in a budget archive that wasn't included in the destruction order. Those documents provided proof the program had existed but left massive gaps in the historical record. Congress learned of the destruction and did nothing. Destroying government records is a federal crime. But Helms was never charged. He'd later face charges for lying to Congress about Chile operations, receive a suspended sentence and fine, and have his legal fees paid by CIA supporters who raised money through a defense fund. The culture destruction went unpunished, and the precedent became institutional wisdom. If you're running controversial programs, destroy the evidence before investigators arrive, then express regret that complete investigation is impossible without records. The absence of evidence becomes its own defense. Then came Guatemala. In 2010, more than 60 years after the fact, medical historian Susan Reverby discovered documentation of U.S. government experiments that made even seasoned researchers recoil. According to her findings, published in academic journals and confirmed through archive research, between 1946 and 1948, U.S. Public Health Service doctors deliberately infected Guatemalan prisoners, psychiatric patients, and sex workers with syphilis and gonorrhea without their knowledge or consent. The research was designed to test penicillin's effectiveness against sexually transmitted diseases, knowledge that would benefit American soldiers and civilians. The subjects were Guatemalans who had no idea they were being infected. According to the documented protocols, researchers used multiple infection methods: direct inoculation, infected prostitutes brought to prisons, and application of bacteria to open wounds. Roughly 1,300 people were deliberately exposed. At least 83 died, though establishing definitive causation decades later proved difficult. The experiments were conducted with the cooperation of Guatemalan health officials, who weren't told the full nature of the research. When the program ended in 1948, the researchers simply left. No follow-up care was provided. No records were given to Guatemalan authorities. The experiments were classified and filed away. In 2010, when Reverby's research forced the truth into public view, President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued formal apologies to Guatemala. The U.S. government offered to fund historical research and STD treatment programs in Guatemala, but no compensation was provided to victims or families. Most victims were dead, and proving specific harm from experiments conducted 60 years earlier was legally impossible. The doctors who'd conducted the experiments had long since died. The institutions that had hosted them expressed regret but faced no sanctions, and the timing of the revelation was darkly instructive. The experiments had been conducted after Nuremberg, after the world had supposedly learned that medical experimentation without consent was a war crime. American doctors had helped write the Nuremberg Code, then immediately violated its principles in a country whose government lacked power to object or demand accountability. The apology came 6 decades late. Justice didn't come at all. The prosecutors never showed up. From 1977 onward, as congressional investigations exposed McCultra, COINTELPRO, radiation experiments, and dozens of other programs involving illegal activities, observers waited for criminal charges that never materialized. According to legal scholars who studied the aftermath, 0 CIA officials, military officers, or government doctors faced criminal prosecution for conducting experiments on unwitting Americans, destroying federal records, or violating constitutional rights. The reasons varied by case but followed patterns. Some investigations concluded that while the activities were unethical, they hadn't technically violated laws that existed at the time, a circular argument that ignored long-standing prohibitions on assault, battery, and destruction of government property. Other cases ran into jurisdictional problems. Who had authority to prosecute CIA officers for classified programs? How could you prove criminal intent when defendants claimed they'd been following orders and believed they were serving national security? Several potential prosecutions were blocked by the Justice Department itself, which cited concerns about exposing intelligence methods, damaging agency morale, and setting precedents that might complicate future intelligence operations. The following order's defense, discredited at Nuremberg, worked perfectly for American officials. Unlike Nazi officers, U.S. intelligence personnel could point to actual authorization from superiors and official program documentation. And critically, the passage of time worked in defendants' favor. By the time programs were exposed, many key figures had retired or died. Statutes of limitations had expired. Evidence had been destroyed, and the political will to prosecute faded as new crises demanded attention. A few officials faced administrative sanctions, reassignment, denied promotions, forced early retirement. None went to prison, none lost their pensions. The institutional protection held. And the lesson was absorbed by everyone in the system. You could violate rights, destroy evidence, and lie to Congress, and as long as you stayed within the bureaucracy and claimed national security justification, the criminal justice system wouldn't touch you. The professors kept their positions and their reputations. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as universities' roles in hosting classified human experiments became public knowledge, observers waited for academic consequences that rarely came. According to reviews of university personnel records obtained through investigative journalism, most researchers who'd conducted McCulture experiments, radiation studies, or other ethically questionable programs continued their careers without significant sanctions. Some had already retired before their involvement was revealed. Others were still active faculty members when exposure came. The university's response followed a pattern, acknowledged the historical facts, expressed regret for past ethical failures, note that the researchers had operated under different standards, and then do nothing. No tenure revocations. No removal of emeritus status. No strikes from the academic record. A few universities renamed buildings or removed names from awards. Most didn't even do that. The researchers themselves, when still alive to comment, generally defended their work as necessary for national security during the Cold War. Some expressed regret about the lack of informed consent, but maintained the scientific value of their findings. A few received honors and recognition for their other contributions to their fields. According to university administrators who spoke to journalists, conducting historical sanctions against deceased or retired faculty seemed pointless. What would it accomplish? The actual answer, unstated, was that thorough accounting would force institutions to confront their own complicity, potentially expose them to liability, and damage relationships with government funders. Better to express general regret, implement modern ethical guidelines, and move forward without dwelling on specifics. The researchers' published work remained in scientific literature, cited and built upon. Their careers remained intact in official histories. And the implicit message to current faculty was clear. Even extreme ethical violations, if conducted under government contracts, wouldn't actually derail your academic career as long as you could claim you'd been following the protocols of your time. The victims kept dying while the paperwork stalled. Throughout the 2000s, as radiation and less test subjects aged and their health deteriorated, compensation claims wound through bureaucratic processes designed more to delay than to resolve. According to advocates working with victims, most claims were denied on technical grounds: inability to prove participation in specific experiments due to destroyed records, inability to establish direct causation between experiments and current health problems, expiration of statutes of, limitations for civil claims, and insufficient documentation of informed consent violations. The burden of proof fell entirely on victims who were asking institutions to acknowledge experiments those institutions had spent decades denying, and whose records they'd systematically destroyed. Some victims received modest settlements, a few $1,000s in exchange for signing liability waivers and confidentiality agreements. Most received nothing. According to actuarial estimates, by 2010, over 90% of documented culture subjects had died. The radiation experiment victims fared similarly. Decades of exposure to carcinogens meant most died before compensation mechanisms existed, and those who lived long enough to apply often died before their claims were processed. The bureaucratic structure wasn't designed to deny claims through explicit rejection. It was designed to delay them until natural mortality solved the problem. Processing times measured in years. Appeals processes that restarted timelines. Requirements for documentation that no longer existed. And always, the careful expressions of sympathy from officials who explained they'd love to help, but their hands were tied by regulations, budgets, and legal constraints. A few victims won their cases through persistence and legal representation. Most simply died waiting, their claims technically still pending when they expired, and the government's actuarial tables had predicted this outcome precisely. Delay long enough, and the liability resolves itself through mortality. The pattern repeated with scientific precision. In 1997, Jeffrey Wiggin became famous for blowing the whistle on tobacco industry deception, a corporate rather than government case, but the institutional response patterns were identical. According to documentation from various government whistleblower cases throughout the 1990s and 2000s, researchers or officials who exposed unethical programs faced systematic retaliation, career destruction, security clearance revocations, harassment, blacklisting from their fields, and legal threats. The institutions they'd worked for deployed standard responses, questioned the whistleblower's motives, suggest mental instability, emphasize violated confidentiality agreements, and ensure they never worked in their field again. Meanwhile, the officials and institutions being exposed received protection, legal defense funded by government resources, invocation of state secrets privilege to block lawsuits, and quiet reassignment rather than termination. The dynamic was consistent whether the whistleblower revealed ongoing human experiments, fraudulent research, or illegal surveillance. Speaking out meant professional suicide. Staying silent meant career advancement. According to interviews with former government scientists, the lesson was learned and internalized. If you discover something unethical, the smart move is to document it quietly, request transfer, and hope someone else deals with it. Actually reporting the problem meant destroying your own career while the institution survived largely intact. Whistleblower protection laws existed on paper, but proved ineffective in practice. Classified programs could be shielded from whistleblower complaints by claiming disclosure would harm national security. And the pattern held. Institutions protected themselves through legal mechanisms and bureaucratic procedures, while individuals who challenged them were systematically destroyed as cautionary examples. The machinery survived not through winning arguments, but through making opposition personally catastrophic. The reforms looked substantial on paper. In 1976, Congress passed the Intelligence Oversight Act, creating new requirements for congressional notification of covert operations and establishing permanent intelligence committees in both houses. According to the legislative history, the act was designed to prevent future abuses like McCultra and COINTELPRO by ensuring that Congress would be informed of intelligence activities and could exercise meaningful oversight. The reality was more complicated. According to former Intelligence Committee staffers who spoke to journalists years later, the notification requirements contained loopholes large enough to drive entire programs through. Timely notification was undefined. Agencies could delay informing Congress until operations were complete. Briefings could be limited to just 8 members of Congress, the Gang of 8, who were prohibited from sharing information with their colleagues or staff. And critically, the act included a classified annex that contained exceptions for certain types of programs that could continue without notification if deemed essential to national security. The Gang of 8 would later acknowledge they'd been briefed on programs, but felt powerless to stop them. What could 8 members do against unified agency opposition and claims that exposure would endanger operations? The oversight committees gained access to more information, but struggled to exercise actual control. According to budget analyses, intelligence spending continued growing steadily after 1976. Suggesting operational capacity expanded rather than contracted. The act created the appearance of accountability while preserving operational autonomy. Congress got briefings, agencies got permission, and the machinery adapted to the new requirements with minimal disruption to actual operations. 3 years later came the ethics reformation. In 1979, the Department of Health and Human Services issued the Belmont Report, establishing foundational principles for human subjects research, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. According to the report, published by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, informed consent would now be mandatory for all federally funded research involving human subjects. Institutional review boards would oversee research protocols. Vulnerable populations would receive special protections. It sounded comprehensive. But the Belmont Report came with a footnote that most people never read. According to the full regulatory framework that followed, National security research could be exempted from standard informed consent requirements if approved through classified procedures. Intelligence agencies could conduct research on human subjects using alternative oversight mechanisms that weren't subject to public review. The regulations created robust protections for civilian academic research while preserving loopholes for classified programs. According to bioethicists who've studied the implementation, the post-Belmont era saw genuine improvements in academic research ethics, but murky continuity in government research. Informed consent became standard in universities while remaining optional for programs deemed essential to national security. The ERB system worked well for visible research, while classified research continued under separate authorities that the Belmont Commission had no power to regulate. The report established important ethical principles. The exceptions ensured those principles didn't actually constrain intelligence operations. And the two-tier system persisted. Public research became more ethical, while secret research remained beyond meaningful civilian oversight. The echoes came later and darker. In December 2014, the Senate Intelligence Committee released portions of its report on CIA interrogation practices following 9/11. According to the 500-page executive summary, the full 6,700-page report remains classified. The CIA had used enhanced interrogation techniques that bore unmistakable resemblance to methods developed through McCultra and other behavioral research programs: stress positions, sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, waterboarding, and psychological tactics designed to produce learned helplessness and compliance. The techniques had been refined through the military's SERE program: survival, evasion, resistance, escape training, which itself drew on knowledge compiled through decades of experimentation on Americans. The report documented that the techniques were brutal, often ineffective for intelligence gathering, and resulted in severe psychological damage to detainees. The CIA disputed the findings, and then the pattern repeated with eerie precision. Defenders claimed the techniques were legal under Justice Department opinions, necessary for national security, and different from torture despite producing similar effects. No CIA officials faced prosecution. The psychologists who designed the program received multi-million-dollar contracts and were shielded from liability. The Senate report prompted renewed calls for accountability that faded within months, and observers noted the continuity. The knowledge base built on American subjects in the 1950s and 1960s had been applied to foreign subjects in the 2000s. The institutional structures had remained intact, and the accountability mechanisms had failed in precisely the same ways. History wasn't repeating. It had never actually stopped. The files remain sealed even now. As of the 2020s, according to declassification researchers and FOIA specialists, an unknown number of intelligence programs from the Cold War era remain classified under rolling extensions that push release dates decades into the future. The standard classification period is 25 years, but agencies can request extensions in 25-year increments almost indefinitely. Documents from the 1950s that should have been declassified in the 1980s remain sealed in the 2020s, under claims that release would damage national security, reveal sources and methods, or endanger ongoing operations. The logic is circular and unfalsifiable. The programs are still classified because they're still sensitive, and they're still sensitive because they're still classified. According to the National Archives, hundreds of thousands of pages of CIA, military, and FBI documents from the McCultra era remain unreleased. FOIA requests are denied or result in heavily redacted documents with entire pages blacked out. The most sensitive experiments, the most extreme violations, the programs that would be most damaging to agency reputations, those records, if they still exist, remain locked away. And the unsettling possibility remains: we may know about McCultra, COINTELPRO, and radiation experiments only because evidence survived despite destruction orders. The programs we don't know about are the ones where the cover-up succeeded completely. The research continued under different management. Throughout the 2000s and into the 2020s, according to public budget documents and academic research partnerships, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has funded extensive research into brain-computer interfaces, memory manipulation, behavior modification through neural stimulation, and pharmaceutical cognitive enhancement. The research involves human subjects who are described as voluntary participants, primarily military personnel and veterans. The consent forms are more detailed than anything used in the MKUltra era. The oversight is supposedly more rigorous. But according to bioethicists and military researchers who've studied the programs, the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. The military funds research on altering human cognition and behavior, uses service members as subjects, and maintains broad discretion over what constitutes adequate, informed consent when national security interests are involved. Post 9/11 regulations weakened certain informed consent requirements for military personnel in combat zones or preparing for deployment. The research is legal, documented, and reviewed by committees. It's also remarkably similar in goals to what was being pursued in the 1950s, just with better technology, better lawyers, and better paperwork. The researchers haven't stopped. They've simply gotten more sophisticated about compliance documentation while pursuing the same fundamental objectives. Understanding how to manipulate human psychology and biology to serve military and intelligence purposes. Public memory dissolved faster than the programs did. According to polling data from the 2010s, most Americans under 40 have never heard of MKUltra. History textbooks mention Cold War espionage, but rarely discuss domestic intelligence abuses. The church committee hearings aren't taught in high school civics classes. Operation Midnight Climax sounds too absurd to be real, so people assume it's conspiracy theory. The radiation experiments are forgotten footnotes. When activists or researchers mention these programs, they're often dismissed as paranoid or exaggerating. Surely the government didn't actually dose citizens with LSD in brothels, didn't actually inject people with plutonium, didn't actually release bacteria over cities. Except they did, it's documented, and the documentation is publicly available for anyone willing to read it. But public attention moved on. New crises emerged. The infrastructure that enabled the programs remained intact, quietly renamed and reorganized, waiting to be activated when the next national security crisis made extreme measures seem necessary again. The normalization is complete. The programs are simultaneously historical fact and forgotten history, and the machinery that made them possible never actually stopped. It just learned to operate more carefully, with better legal cover and less public visibility. The office stayed occupied. The promises kept being made. Somewhere in a federal building tonight, researchers are studying how to influence human behavior more effectively, how to gather intelligence more completely, how to protect national security through methods that exist in the gray zone between legal and ethical. The paperwork is in order. The oversight committees have been briefed. The consent forms use the right language. And if history is any guide, we'll learn the full truth in about 50 years. When most participants are dead, accountability is impossible, and the revelations feel like ancient history rather than urgent scandal. The archives keep growing, each generation adding its own classified experiments to the collection. Get comfortable now. Let your mind drift. The uncomfortable truths make better lullabies than you'd think. At least you know how the machinery actually works. Sleep well. The programs continue. They always have.